Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for more podcasting greatness on all platforms where good podcasts are sold, and with video also here on YouTube. Hey everybody, you can see this week I have finally gotten back together with Jon Atack. Hey Jon, welcome back to the show.
My pleasure, and to my viewers as well. I'm Jon Atack, and here's my guest, Chris Shelton, and I'm his guest too at the same time.
Oh, parallel.
This is the longest pause we've had in quite some time. We usually get together every month or two, and
COVID. I think for me, the university study has been the biggest to my schedule. It has really thrown everything for a loop, and now Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are pretty much Thursday, are getting my critical clips done on Monday first thing for the week, and then I'm into the university world and studying stuff. And I was showing, you can see for us on video, this is just some of the paperwork connected with the stuff I got to read.
A typical 1 hour piece of work there.
That's right. So this has really kind of thrown everything for a loop for me, and I've been adjusting and readjusting, and I think that is probably more of the causative agent than anything else to our schedule disparities. You can see I'm even talking academically now. It's awful.
Schedule disparities.
But it's been fun, and I have missed talking to you, so I'm glad we're doing this.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's always been a good thing to do.
Yeah.
And you were proposing the idea of, we're doing what we can about what I call authoritarianism, coercive control in the world. Mm-hmm. And will we ever be able to overcome this problem? Yeah. To what extent might we be able to overcome it?
Exactly.
Or are we just going to be struggling and swimming against the tide for the rest of our lives? And I speak as somebody who's now spent 37 years swimming against the tide.
Yeah, well, I hear you. I'm coming up on, what is this? 7-8 years now that I've been out. I mean, that's, it's funny how the curve of this, because when I first got out, I was speaking out right away. Right? Because I'm a big mouth. That's what I do. I can't not talk. I have been this way. This is not a Scientology thing. I have been this way since I was a rugrat. I was the kid who got his mouth taped in school because I wouldn't stop talking in class. I was the guy whose notes from the teacher always said, well, Chris is very bright. I literally have this. Chris is very bright, but he really has a hard time controlling his mouth.
Motor mouth.
Yes, yeah. Motor mouth. That's right. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by that. That is a lifelong trait that I have had. And so I hit the ground running when I got out of Scientology and started going. And a lot of people thought, wow, he really got over this quickly. He really, is speaking out so fast, and this is so amazing, and I was speaking fluently and coherently, and I wasn't screaming and crying and ripping, chewing the rug. And so I think a lot of people thought that I made a lot more progress in this thing we call recovery, than I actually had. And fortunately, I didn't buy into that too much after the first year, after I really got my head around how this was going to take a long time. And there was a lot to dig up and look at with this, because I'd been in Scientology for so many years, Yeah. So where I'm going with this is that I brought up this idea today for us to talk about because I have been studying this for 8-9 years, I guess, right? 7-8 years. And now I'm attending university. I'm going for a master's degree in this topic of coercive control and psychology. I've now dived into books and papers on psychology and psychiatry and where we're at with this stuff. The way we're studying it, we're also bringing in legal and the law and how the law has responded to this stuff. We're covering domestic violence, we're covering gangs, we're covering terrorism, as well as cults. So we're getting a very well-rounded look at this behavior. And what it got me thinking about is that, well, actually what I've been saying for some time, which is that, cult leaders, charismatic leaders, people who engage in coercive control are really manipulating very basic parts of your psychology, our psychology, that are there regardless. They're not creating something new in us, in other words. It isn't a peculiar phenomena of psychology that causes someone to engage in coercive control or be at the receiving end of coercive control and do bad things. What's happening is we are leveraging basic cognitive processes and rational mechanisms that we've developed over the centuries, like cognitive dissonance, and we're leveraging this against people and manipulating them in ways that cause them to act certain ways as prescribed by the cult leader or the terrorist cult, cell leader, or the narcissistic partner in the domestic violence sphere. So where this sent me was thinking, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, if that's the premise that I'm going on, and so far that's what I believe it to be true, is there such a thing as a cure for cultism, right? Or for coercive control? That all being said, what's your initial take on this, Jon?
Well, we're dealing with human behavior. It's important to know that not every human society has behaved in the same way. And curiously, the last conversation we had, you said you were going to have to find a PhD in history.
Yes, I remember that.
Not being a PhD, of course, you can't believe me. But and I'd suggested, had there ever been a time when people had lived at peace? And I said, yes, the Indus Valley civilization for 700 years. Mm-hmm. There is no evidence of warfare. They don't have weapons of war. They also don't have any temples, and they don't have any palaces in that period. So they seem to have had an egalitarian society.
And that, I think, would be the point of it. Didn't we talk about the size of the population having something to do with that too?
Well, possibly, but it was quite a large, it's up on the borders of northwest India, on the border of Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Northwest part of the Indian subcontinent, most of it's in Pakistan, that it flourished, and there were quite a lot of people involved here. Okay. And they did have defense works along their southern border, so there's somebody had tried to mess with them at some point. Mm-hmm. But it was just the thought that if it has happened, if people have been able to live this way, then it can happen. If we look then to the Kogi, Kogi people in Colombia, when the conquistador came in the 17th century, they fled up their mountain. And they've been living there ever since, losing more territory. And a BBC crew eventually got in there, and they sat for 3 years. They went back every year to try and get in and talk to these astonishing people. And they found a society that had been just kept itself apart. There are parts of the mountain that were actually irrigation channels and things that were built by the Kogi before the conquistador, and the conquistador were coming in the 16th and 17th century. And these still work. There are still gardens that have maintained themselves almost because of the way they were established by these people. So these people are quite remarkable.
We're referring here to the Kogi people, Kogi. Is that right?
Yeah.
And this is just quickly looking them up for the audience. The word Kogi means jaguar in the Kogi language. Maybe I'm saying Kogi wrong, but I'm just Kogi.
I don't know.
Yeah, and they are an indigenous ethnic group that live in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta Mountains in northern Colombia. Yeah. Their civilization has continued since the pre-Columbian era. So yeah, they were the Kogi are descendants of the Torona culture, which flourished before the times of the Spanish conquest. Advanced civilization built many stone structures and pathways in the jungles, made gold objects that they would hang from the trees and around their necks, lived not much differently than modern-day Kogi. Before the conquistadors arrived, the Tairona were forced to move into the highlands, exactly like you said, around 1000 CE.
Yeah.
And the decision to flee to the mountains proved beneficial and strategic by the time the Spanish entered modern-day Colombia in the 15th century. So that's interesting. Then the missionaries came, began to influence their way of life.
I think that's wrong. It's the 16th century, not the 15th.
Oh, yeah, citation needed. It could be wrong.
Well, 1492, Columbus arrived in Cuba, so they aren't going into Colombia in the 15th century. They've only got 8 years left of the 15th century after Columbus lands. So I think it's 16th century. But I'm being pedantic here. I know.
No, I was just curious about what else there could be to glean on this really fast, because we're of course looking for why are they not like the rest of us,
let me say that their history, when the BBC people talked with them, they actually they talk about having dogs set on them by the conquistador, which was a typical method, that they'd have killer dogs that would go and rip people to pieces because they weren't Christians, so they didn't deserve to live. That's the way it works. But what's fascinating in this society, and what I hold on to, is that it is they have managed to create a society that appears to have almost no crime.
Yeah, it is interesting looking through the lifestyle here. This is a civilization that has a simple mode of dress, cotton weaving, etc. They live in villages containing circular huts made of stone, mud, and palm leaves. Men live in a separate hut from the women and children.
Always a good idea.
It might not
snoring.
be. Right. Each village contains a large hut called a nuhu or temple where only men are allowed. In the nuhu, many things are discussed and decisions are made. Women are not allowed because the Kogi believe that women are more connected to the Great Mother and have no need of entering the temple. There are also women priests in the villages. Okay, so this isn't the men dominate through religious belief. Okay, not at all.
What's more, the leaders are called mamas.
Well, yeah, all consultations are done with mamos, M-A-M-O-S.
Who are in fact men.
And many of the decisions are based on their wisdom and knowledge. Many Kogi marriages are arranged by mamoas to ensure the most fruitful communities. However, marriages are not forced, and the buying and selling of women is not permitted. Although women
I'm against it then.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, these guys are clearly off the rails. Although women as young as 14 can be married and have children. The Kogi,
same's true in Louisiana, I believe.
Basically, the Kogi do not allow the mistreatment of women. And it is not...
No, they're very strong about that.
That's apparently
you're not allowed to shout at women, let alone hit them.
Interesting. And it's not uncommon to find marriages that were not arranged, but the Kogi also disapprove of breaking arranged marriages. Fields, houses. Now I'm just reading some of this to give an idea of the flavor of what are they doing differently. Because sometimes you can be surprised.
I can tell you what they're doing differently without going to Wikipedia, if you like.
Well, I just think
we can also have everybody read out, because I'm going to mention 17 other cultures. Are you going to?
No, but I just wanted to look up. I get to look up what I want to look up, and it says here that this is a fascinating business here, which is bilateral inheritance. Do you know about that? Because this is interesting.
I don't know about bilateral inheritance.
Well, see, Wikipedia can teach you something too, John.
I'm not saying it can't teach me something. I'm saying that it might get a bit complicated, because I also want to talk about the sun, the barca, and the wheat shoal. And it's just to say why these,
Right.
I don't think that's going to tell us the fundamental reasons as to why this society differs from ours. And I can tell you that because I have read about these things.
Fair enough.
Much as I respect the authors of Wikipedia, except when they're writing about cult groups and modern events where they seem to be completely useless, frankly. My biography on Wikipedia, I am the center of the UK movement against Scientology, according to Wikipedia. I haven't been active in the counter-cult movement since 1996, but Gordon Melton says I am. So the point is that there are a variety of societies. The San in the Kalahari are another, where they don't seem to have these murderous instincts. The Ba'aka pygmy, they don't seem to do this. Come on, quick, read us all the Wikipedia entries. The Huichol in central Mexico. And it's saying that therefore the nature of culture is absolutely essential. This is the only point I'm trying to make here. I'm not really trying to belittle and humiliate you. The central point is that different cultures act in different ways. There was a study that could never be repeated that was done with Amazon cultures long ago. I don't remember the details of it, but it's not the sort of thing you could repeat. Some sociologists or anthropologists had found, probably in the 1930s or something, that they'd found this one village that was really peaceful and everybody was really nice all the time. And then 100 miles away, they'd found this village where people were really horrible. And they swapped some people between the villages. Not the kind of thing that an ethical review board would permit these days, thankfully. And they found that the people took on the characteristics of the society into which they were put. So
Sapolsky talks about similar things being done with baboon or certain ape troops or chimp troops.
Yeah.
Right. They would do that.
Eugene Morais's, the original work that was done with baboons in South America, The Soul of the Ape, which is one of the great books, The Soul of the White Ant and The Soul of the Ape, the first two books of investigative animal biology. Yes, you'll find that there are cultural effects. This is vital in our subject, that authoritarianism, in studying psychopaths, Kent Keel spent, he's done fine grade fMRI scans, functional magnetic resonance imaging scans on more than 500 people, and reports this in a book called The Psychopath Whisperer. And what he found was that criminal psychopaths in prison, and nobody volunteered outside of prison to have an fMRI for some reason, but so he had to do them. He had to have a mobile one, and he went all over the place in Canada and I think in North America. And he assayed more than 500 people, and he found that they were all deficient in the connection between the limbic system, the old brain, and the frontal cortex, the thinking brain. So we like to think. They were all of them. Every one of them had a less connective tissue between the reactive, instant, violent, aggressive part, animal, crocodile part of the brain, and the human, the part of the brain that's unique to humans. And so he showed that there was a genetic basis for this. And it's very hard to argue against. Having said that, the deficit averages out to about 7%. So it's not, it's not a huge thing, but it's there. You then have 3 genetic alleles that are associated with the psychopathic disorder. And by the psychopathic disorder, I now take Robert Hare's extreme definition, which is these are the criminal psychopaths, not the sociopaths who he puts lower down, not the narcissists, but the violent, unpleasant, horrible people. So in studying them, there is at the moment some pretty good evidence that what we're dealing with is physiological. However, the Mendota study, where they took a lot of adolescents who had the callous and unemotional disorder, which is what you, until you're 18, that's what it's called. On your 18th birthday, hey, you've become a psychopath. You can't diagnose people under the age of 18 because we don't want to label them. So we just give them a different label and pretend that we don't know what we're doing. They took 2 groups, sizable groups. Control group, I think, committed 17 murders after being released. And the group that had received treatment and help committed no murders. Okay. And this broke this notion that we've had that there's nothing you can do with people who are born with this disorder. What appears to be the case is that if they are treated with respect, if they are not brutalized as they are in prisons to this day, then there is a chance that their behavior will become better. We also know with the psychopathic disorder that as people get older, and certainly when they reach the age of about 50, so getting there, this behavior tends to decline. So we've got some science around here. If we then go to the notion of coercive control, as I say, I like to focus on authoritarianism. And I've just done this fantastic seminar for Russia. I was just really excited about it. It's a teacher's training course. It's going to be going out next week. But it meant I got to talk with my good friend, Alexander Dvorkin. And he said, well, but I call these groups totalitarian. Why do you call them authoritarian? And I said, well, I've been calling them totalitarian and totalist, same thing, for a long time. It's a common way of describing them, but it's not actually my experience. I'm not against total authoritarianism, or totalitarianism. It's a word that was pressed together to mean that. I think first talking about Mussolini in the 30s. I'm not just against totalitarianism, I'm against authoritarianism. So even if it's the mild form, where you've got somebody who believes that they should be in charge, and that's an authoritarian leader, and you've got somebody who believes that somebody should be in charge of them, and that's an authoritarian follower, I'm against all of that. I would like to see a society in which people make choices together, in which there is a consensus among people, in which we make progress forward by talking about things, by thinking about them, by analyzing them, by considering the evidence. I understand at the moment there's this funny number and it keeps coming up. Schopenhauer, the philosopher, and I can now say I've actually read some Schopenhauer. I've read about 20 pages of it. He wrote this great book about how to be happy, which starts out by saying, I've explained that human beings are miserable, and now I'm going to... But he put forward the point of view that about 60% of people can't think. They're not able to make decisions. Erich Fromm, writing 100 years later, came to a very similar conclusion. He said they have a pseudo-self. All they're doing is trying to be, not to be criticized for the way they behave, trying to have the right kind of automobile and the right kind of house and scrub their children and have their hair cut the proper way and fit in, conform. So they don't actually develop a self. You then look to Milgram in the early 60s, and he comes up with this 60% again. He says that 60% of people in the first, 62.5%, I think it was, in the first study where they're asked to shock people, they'll go all the way to the triple X on the machine. I mean, sadly, 100% were willing to shock people. And we are told that those conformity numbers are coming down slightly.
Well, I have to be super, super clear because this is something I have looked into a bit. And it really depends on Milgram as to how the study is conducted and where. Because you will
I'm talking about the first Milgram study. He conducted 17.
Oh, the first one. Okay, got it. Because the replication is also part of the process. And the replication of this has shown varied results around the world. And for example, if you're an engineer, almost anywhere, you're not likely to fall into those percentages. If you are a Japanese male, you are likely to not be a conformist in the same percentages. So there are differences here. It's not a universal thing, right?
I question both of those statements. Those are conformity studies. They're not replications of Milgram. I'm not aware of Japanese replication of Milgram. The engineer study is a Solomon Asch study on the conformity.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was confusing that with Asch. My bad.
Yeah.
My bad. Confused Asch and Milgram. My bad.
Yeah. But we're talking about the same thing. So the point you're making, I agree with.
Yeah.
But the first thing is just to establish this peculiar number, this 60% that just keeps on coming up. Jane McGregor, who published a book about 10 years ago about what she calls the sociopath, empath, apath triad. She's a professor at Nottingham University. And her idea is that sociopaths, which would include psychopaths and whatever, find apaths, who are people who can be manipulated emotionally to attack empath. And she reckons that 60% of people are apaths. So I'm fascinated by this number.
Well, I am too, but I am cautiously reserved about that number because until I can see the methodology of how these things were done.
I'm not saying this is a truth, Chris.
Okay,
let me
fair enough.
go to the next point. The next point is to say that if that is a number that's of use to us,
Mm-hmm.
then it says if we could change that number, and I believe, that's what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
The evidence in conformity studies, though, I must say that the ethics committees have made it impossible, and quite rightly so,
Mm-hmm.
to check most of these studies anymore. We can't do Zimbardo anymore.
That's right.
Got the BBC prison experiment, which I think is massively, it's quoted so often as disproving Zimbardo, and you look at it and you say, but they sorted out anybody before they did the study who might not be empathetic. And even so, by the end of it, they were bullying the other people. So these studies, we have to approach them with tremendous caution. They should never be seen in the same way as experiments in chemistry, physics, and biology, because they are not. They are, as you say, culturally dependent, gender dependent,
geographically dependent. I mean, it really, all these factors matter tremendously. And you can look at Sapolsky if you have questions, big, huge, wide questions as to how this works, because he breaks it down in his Stanford lectures on this. Yeah.
And I think the important thing is that there is such variation, which is why I talk about the Weichel and the Coggy and what have you.
Yep.
Indicating that we can culturally change these things. So the answer to the question, your initial question, is yes, I believe that a change can be made. The next question is how.
Right.
But
that's the thing okay, cool. Well, that's the thing I've been wondering about, because my thought on this, I mean, I'm not going to go so far as to say I have a whole logically thought out premise, other than kind of, but I do want to reiterate that, well, let me ask you this. What sort of things do you see or are you finding in your survey of these cultures or these areas or these territories or populations? What are you seeing as the common denominators, and or is it something with the group itself that is causing that behavior, or is it something external to the group that has caused that's brought about that behavior? Like what are you seeing as causative agents here?
I think the broad sort of sway of history shows us that as you know, I've focused down. 5 years ago, I published a book called Opening Minds, and we're just about to publish an updated edition of it, which is going to be called Opening Our Minds, because I'd like mine to be open too. Just to say that. But as I focused on the problem, that I left Scientology. I spent years creating the history of first and still only history of Scientology. The first attempt at it, Janet Reitman borrowed and copied it, but that doesn't make her a historian. And Chris Owen and Tony Ortega and you in your own work are extending that history most definitely and in wonderful ways. But having got through the history of Scientology, worked, that book, that Sully's People, A Piece of Blue Sky, was the basis for Russell Miller's Barefaced Messiah. It's the manuscript he worked from, and I was his researcher from the day he signed the contract to being his expert witness in court. And I believe it's true that I'm the only person who's ever been appointed an expert witness on the subject of Scientology by a court. There are people with more general expertise, but apparently I'm an expert on Scientology and have been since 1987. But that, of course, finding the biography of Hubbard, the thing of Scientology, of course, you come to this thing like, ooh, how did this happen? How was I taken in? How are people taken in? How did I believe such crazy nonsense? It's like, oh, it's so embarrassing. What's the worst thing you can say about me? He used to believe in Scientology. It's, oh, no.
Gets used against me all the time. I get it.
Yeah. But that took me into, other cults. And I read about cults ancient and modern. I got back to the Eleusinian mysteries of 1200 BC, which give us the word mystery. And versions of which, Scientology is a version of it. They have levels of initiation where you apparently become more a member of the electoi, or the elite, as the Gnostics called them. And the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, all of these groups that have this idea that you're achieving some wonderful powers and knowledge, which is just a labyrinth of deception. It's just it's what Wittgenstein called a language trap. That you've convinced yourself that these things are happening, and they aren't. That's
Exactly.
just wake up, grow up, and get over it. I started in the 90s, the early 90s, having gone through everything I could read about mind control, William Sargent's Battle for the Mind, his Mind Possessed, and his other book, and, Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control. I talked with whoever I could talk with and just set about putting this, it seemed to me that the process had frequently been described. I remember one day, it was about 6 a.m, which is a bad time for me because that's 2 hours after I'd normally fall asleep. So I'm still awake, or I've had an hour's sleep. And I was doing an intervention. I did 2 with Hannah and Jerry Whitfield back in 1991. And I was sat there in this hotel. I'm going, why am I doing this stuff? All of this stuff about mind control. Nobody's paying any. And suddenly a thought floated through. At that time, I considered myself still to be a Buddhist. I still pursued enlightenment. And it suddenly hit me that what the Buddha was trying to teach people was exactly this, mind control. Why it is that we're susceptible to the control of other people. And the liberation, the great moksha, the satori, samadhi, the enlightenment, would be the moment where all of that intellectual machinery, that the superego, the control from your culture, the genetic id part of what was going on in you would suddenly, it would all come into focus. And I realized that the topic was the same. Since then, I've stopped believing in enlightenment, which makes it a bit more complicated. But I did realize, therefore, that the texts of the mystics, Christian, Jewish, Sufi, they're all about this. They're all about freedom of mind. They're all about not thinking about it in the way that everybody else thinks about it. And of course, as they say in Buddhism, ultimately, you have to lose the desire to become Buddha, in losing desire. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him is one of the side statements of Zen Buddhism. The Buddha himself didn't offer this. But I realized, and each one of them becomes a trap. Within a generation, any one of these methods. So if you look, for example, my favorite example is the great poet Rumi, Mavlavi, who is, I believe, still the biggest selling poet in the United States, even though he was a Muslim. Imagine that, given all the anti-Muslim fervor over there. Brilliant poet, who 13th century, born in what is now Turkey, Anatolia, wrote largely in Farsi. Only about 10% of his work has been translated. I regard him as, he's the Shakespeare of Iran. He's this, but where Shakespeare was a miserable bugger, let's be honest about it. To be or not to be, I don't know. But absolutely brilliant and penetrative in his thinking. Rumi's the other end of the temperament. He's actually perfectly happy. And he puts forward this idea that we are actually living within a perfect world. We are actually here right now, and we can have this perfect life because of the construction in which, the construction that we have made around ourselves, how we believe and what we believe. He shows something of the nature of belief itself. And again, we find in his work, and we find in the work of, we can find it in the Bhagavad Gita. We are the construction of our own thoughts. That the echoes of these thoughts go through all human culture. That's all that I'm really saying. In modern times, Western psychology believes it has discovered something, whereas in fact, there are, as some people say, only 5 ways of looking at the world. And they are the 5 forms of Greek philosophy: Aristotelian, Platonic, cynical, Epicurean, and Stoic. And your temperament will determine how you look at them. What we need to do is to shift ideas. So if I look back to the Victorian period, the 19th century, 4-year-old children were being sent up chimneys to clean them. And if they got stuck, they were left there to die.
Wow, I didn't know that.
4-year-old children were being sent down the mines to work as pit ponies. It happened in the US. It happened throughout Europe. What we have seen, and this becomes important, I think, what we have seen is an incredible cultural change. We don't accept that anymore.
Right.
We as a culture, we don't accept the idea that you can sell an 8-year-old girl for a bottle of gin.
That is correct.
I think that movement is the movement against authoritarianism. It's the movement against the tribal chieftains, the psychopathic leaders, the warlords who have governed so many human societies. So I think by understanding the problems of authoritarianism, by labeling it, it's taken me all of these years to just, and I know my friend Christian Sherko or Stephen Hassan, we've all come to this same word, authoritarian, that this is what's, or Jessica Turville, we're all kind of going, yeah, it's that belief system, it's that thing, oh, I need to be led, rather than I can be part of the process of decision.
But but my quandary, my real quandary with this, and the thing that the genesis of this discussion was the thought process in my head of, yeah, but that's how we innately, genetically, instinctively, like naturally, organically, doesn't it seem that from the way we structure our societies, the way we structure any company, any group, almost any activity that we get involved in, is built on a hierarchical model. It's not egalitarian. There's a model of authority, and it's built into us. These are the things I call. Well, let me finish with this because if you watch now, I'm not trying to make academic level claims here. I'm talking out of my experience and knowledge. But if you observe children, you can certainly find lots of examples, and I certainly can from my own experience growing up and watching other people, that there is this tendency, as you've broken down so brilliantly already, in terms of, there's a 60% or 40% or whatever, there's a percent of people who are going to be followers, who we might call, actually I don't want to use this word, but who other people might call sheeple, people who just do what they're told. And it does seem to be, for lack of a better way of understanding it right now, and I really feel hampered by our current, where we're at in our level of advancement of our ability to look into brains and look at how things happen, and the relationship, the mathematical modeling of this is extremely not figured out yet. So we're a long way from peering into the brains of people. And when you talk about fMRIs and stuff, I go, okay, but I want to know all about what questions were asked, what was the situation they were put in, because fMRA is a functional picture of a brain doing a specific thing. So I'd be very interested in what they were told to do when those results came out of this difference between, the sociopaths or psychopaths versus the other people. But regardless of that, I'm just really commenting there on the infancy of our technology with this and the unreliability of it.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel, though, that there seems to be things that I call, for just a way of communicating about it, things we don't have to think about. We just do them. You don't have to think about sleeping. Nobody has to tell you to sleep. You just do it. Nobody has to tell.
I always have to tell my children they've got to go
Yeah,
to
but
sleep.
they'll eventually do it, won't they? I mean, it just happens,
I
right?
hope so.
Same with eating, same with recreating. I mean, these are three of the most basic things going on all of life. Any life, those things are going on. They're things you don't have to think about because they're not learned behavior. They're not cultural behavior. Eating, sleeping, screwing, these are things that are going to happen universally. And no one has to think about whether they should have an impulse to eat or an impulse to sleep or an impulse to screw. It's there. Now, it's going to be there.
I'd hesitate on the third one there, that there are people who don't have the impulse to screw.
I get that I was about to say that I get that there is a spectrum here and that some people
could have been wrong.
Some people are all out on eating, other people not so much.
But you do have to eat and you do have to sleep.
You do.
If you don't do those things, you'll die. If you don't screw, you
won't die, but the species itself has this impulse built into it. And statistically,
it's a different level of drive, and I think it's important to differentiate it.
Fair enough.
Different level of drive.
Fair enough. I do believe, though, that the recreative impulse, statistically speaking, broadly now, I mean, there is no statement you or I can make that we can't find some exception to. So I'm not trying to argue through 100% applicability.
That's not true. That's not true. This is based upon the myth that the exception proves the rule.
Well, that's what I was just trying to argue against.
No, which is a mistranslation of the Latin. Provare doesn't mean to prove, it means to test. The exception tests the rule, is the Latin statement, which has come into popular thought. Of course you can say, if you're a breatharian and you don't eat anything, you will die. There's no human being that's not true of. So you can make statements of an absolute nature.
Fair enough. I am trying to simply say, look, just because you can find some guy who doesn't sleep doesn't mean that what I'm saying is wrong.
There is no such thing as some guy who doesn't sleep.
Well, there are people who claim that, but
but everyone that's been tested, it's been found they microsleep.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
There is no single case, and what's more, they're very badly ill.
Yeah, I'll bet they are. Well, the direction I'm trying to go in here, a
condition called familial insomnia, which kills people who have it. It runs in families, and they lose the ability to sleep, and it kills them.
Wow.
Rats, of course, you take sleep away, it kills them.
Yeah.
So,
okay, fair enough. Well, all I'm really trying to go in.
Hitting somebody on the head with a very big hammer will always squash their head. What can I say? There are things that we can say are palpable.
Okay. Well, all I'm trying to negate there is, okay, look, I say something and well, here's an exception, so you're wrong. Well, it's not how I'm trying to talk right now. I'm just trying to say that I'm trying to explain myself, and I'm trying to say that there is a way of looking at our behavior and the causative elements of our behavior. Why are we doing what we do? Well, some of it is just instinctive, or it's just, we don't have to think about it. We just do it. I believe that from what I've studied so far in all these years, that and I'm happy. That's why I'm discussing it with you, because I'm happy to have my mind changed about this. But I'm bringing this up because it seems to me that the forming of social hierarchies in any group situation is one of these things we don't have to think about. It just happens. No one person has to make it happen in order for it to happen, that a bunch of people will look to another person just naturally and go, here's the guy who needs to lead us, who needs to tell us what to do. I don't know what to do, but I'm more than happy to listen to this guy tell me what to do. And we seem to have a statistical variation of some kind where a certain percentage of us have that inclination, whereas another percentage of us seem to have this, I want to be the leader guy. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be the leader guy, right? I could follow, but I actually want to lead.
But there are two different kinds of leaders.
And there are. That's right. There's a leader who is leading in a constructive path with an understanding that this is a limited authority to do certain things, accomplish goals or purposes that are constructive and positive for the group, and then they're done, right? Rome talked, they had guys who would take charge during times of war, I think, and lead the troops and then go back and give up the authority. I read about that. I don't know if that's true, but
Solon the Archon in the Athenian society in 600 BC is brought in and told to sort the society out, does so and leaves. There are many examples. That's not the differentiation I'm making. The two kinds of leaders, I would use Eric Fromm's term, they are life affirming or life denying. Those are the two kinds of leaders.
Enough.
It's not whether they take a permanent position or not. That doesn't concern me.
No, I get that. I was talking about practically how it works out. But it seems that what Fromm is discussing, or what we are discussing here, what we're trying to sort of categorize or figure out here is these are things that we do that we don't have to think about. You don't have to teach a person to be a follower, be a leader. I mean, you should. I mean, obviously, Ira Shale's work is brilliant. But I mean, what I'm saying is that you naturally, without thinking in any way, little children will do this. They will just line up, in certain categories. And what the categories are doesn't even matter. It's not my point. The fact that there are categories is my point, is that people will do this.
I disagree.
Okay. So why?
The first point is that there are non-hierarchical societies. The San of the Kalahari and the Ba'aka Pygmy do not have tribal chieftains. Mm-hmm. They don't have bosses. Mm-hmm. When they do a particular activity among the Ba'aka, they're very fond of honey, but the honey they like is like 80 feet up in the trees. So when they go to get that honey, the person who's best at climbing trees is in charge of them, but only for that period. Some of the Plains Indians and indeed some of the East Coast Indians, what a horrible word, Native Americans, you find the same thing, that there is leadership of different activities.
But the fact that there is leadership at all is my point.
Yeah, but you see that the leader that's not authoritarian and it's not authority. But
it leads to, but it opens the door to that, which is a beginning.
Very important differentiation that has to be made. Mm-hmm. Authority is the most confusing of subjects. There are two forms of authority. One of them is rank authority. I'm the general, you're the grunt, you do as I tell you. Mm-hmm. The other is expert authority. I'm the surgeon, you need surgery, I know how to do it. I'm the plumber, I'm the electrician. The two concepts become mixed, and that's a very dangerous idea.
But wait a second, isn't there another kind of authority?
Go ahead.
Force. Just straight up force.
Rank authority depends upon force, so yes.
Okay, so rank authority is might is right.
Force is the weapon of, that creates a rank authority. And we accept, that the policeman in your country may shoot you. Mm-hmm. In my country, that doesn't happen very often, thankfully, about once every 3 or 4 years, not once every day. But the authority the police have is based upon their ability to, arrest you, shackle you.
So we would call that rank authority. That all figures as a rank authority versus I have more knowledge. Therefore, I know more about this field than you do. So what I'm telling you is based on a knowledge base from which you should believe, and you give over for that reason.
If we look at leadership, we have leaders like Duterte is a good example in the Philippines. This is a man who's said, and I quote, "My only crime is the extrajudicial killings."
Yeah, he's awful.
The only thing I've done wrong is murder people. What's your problem? Or Bolsonaro, who in Brazil, just where did these people come from? How on earth did they get into any sort of authority over others? Their authority is based upon rank. They've been given a rank, not expertise, not knowledge, and not understanding. There is an amazing sociologist, and you know that I'm not that fond of sociologists generally, but there is an amazing guy called Eli Sagan. He wrote a series of books in which he studied civilization, society, and how it interacts. I read the first one, At the Birth of Tyranny, about 40 years ago now, and it blew my. I was still involved in Scientology. It blew my mind. He looked at the development of society. He said there's a period in society which doesn't seem to have been covered, which is how primitive tribal forms become kingships. How do monarchies form?
Mm-hmm.
And so he looked at the country of Buganda in Africa, which covers the territory of modern Uganda. He looked at Hawaii, and he looked back at the Homeric tales of the fall of Troy to show that there were certain aspects in these societies that were common. Now, Buganda was visited by white people in the 1850s after the cure for malaria, the quinine, had finally been stolen, and you could go into Africa if you were white without dying from malaria. And so they met this society. Victorian intellectuals were able to directly view it. In Hawaii, the king of Hawaii had overthrown the religious system, I think 2 years before, I think it was Cook who first went there, whoever first got there. And so there were no secrets anymore. We have the word taboo from that culture, a spot of ground which you will be killed if you stand on. That's what it means. It's like, so watch out for those little spots around there. There are a lot of them around the perimeter at Gilman Hot Springs, I'm told. So they were able to look at, and he found that in looking at these cultures that there were certain commonplaces. One of them was that there'd be a warrior caste who were homosexual. He found this, it's in the Trojan Wars, it's in Buganda and in Hawaii. And he was just really quite fascinated that there seemed to be this transition point in the society where you'd have these tough guys. If you look, of course, at Hitler, he came to power because of a man called Rome, who led the brown shirts, who, of course, was a homosexual and had a group of homosexuals around. So it's not to say make any comment about homosexuality or about anything. He just found these curious similarities. And he looked at different societies. And
I'm sorry, I have to clarify. I'm truly not understanding exactly what the point was with the homosexuality. So I just want to be clear about it. What was the common denominator there?
He was saying that as societies came into the early form of kingship, where you have a nation being built rather than a tribe, that it appeared in the societies that he looked at, and he didn't know why, and I've no idea why, that there was an elite class of warriors who were homosexual.
Oh, okay. So the warrior class were themselves homosexuals.
Yeah. Huh. And I mean, we look to classical Greece, and we know that basically, if you look at the Symposium by Plato, where Socrates suggests they've been talking about love. The Symposium is about love, and they've been talking about love. And Socrates at one point late at night says, and you can also love a woman. And they all laugh at him.
Huh.
The great intellectuals of, Plato, Aristophanes was there, the playwright. Because what a funny idea. No, love is something you have towards a 12-year-old boy. Love is platonic. It's something. So different societies have taken a different perception.
Okay.
That attitude is still held by the warrior elite in Afghanistan. And it's one of the things that when they were put back into power, they started having dancing boys again. So, there are odd things going on in society.
Wow. Never heard of any of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And it's a rotten tangent because it takes us away. But it was just to say that he found some commonplaces. But what he saw was that there was a development which starts with some thug chieftain who wants to have power over other tribes. And that's why he calls his book The Birth of Tyranny, because he believes almost all human societies derive from this process of thuggery.
But my point is that's a natural process.
Yeah, his point is that he found exceptions.
And why? And it actually circles all the way back to the question I asked you that got us onto this in the first place, which was, what were the causative agents of those groups that you described that do not organically, I guess you could say, follow this model? Because this is the model of tyranny and authoritarianism, but it also seems to me to be, statistically speaking, the vast majority of people fall into this model, and we have these pockets of exception. And I go, great, okay. Why? What is it about those pockets of exception that make them exceptional?
I think the first thing you suggested in talking about the Indus Valley civilization would be scale. Mm-hmm. That one breaks those rules because it seems to have been quite large scale. When you look to the Barca and the San, you're probably coming towards the Dunbar number.
Okay.
You know, that when you get 150 people, you get more than that, they don't know each other anymore.
That's right.
So,
I think that's where libertarianism breaks down too. Not to go on a big tangent about that, but I think it's a small group system. You know,
yeah.
And I think they lose the plot when they try to apply it to a nation like the United States, and you just go, what are you, crazy? But in a small group, frontier territory, uncivilized territory, where there's no central government, there's no central authority, there's no post office, that's when libertarianism is like wonderful, you know?
Yeah. And I think, so that's the first part of it, that it can happen, it is possible. Mm-hmm. The other part of it is this word nature and natural. And it's natural. And we both know Yuval Noah.
Yes, we do.
And he would point us immediately towards the contemporary theory of evolution, not the Mendel Dawkins, you're born with your genes and you're stuck with it. Mm-hmm. Or even it's a matter of, you're dealt your cards and it's how you play them, which is the slightly more adapted view of that. Mm-hmm. But he would say, well, hang on, genes are not read-only. You can write on them.
And yet over millennia, we have been writing this code that enforces or pushes in the direction of the kind of authoritarian hierarchies that we are complaining about and trying to push back against. The vast majority of this planet's population it subscribes to that model of leadership and authority.
Yeah, but we've also seen, the transformative periods. The first great transformation is where there are too many human beings too close together. Mm-hmm. That we now know that if you go back to the first civilizations, which takes us back, Katul Hayuk, to the digging in Turkey, now civilizations that existed in 7000 BC. They predate Sumeria by several thousand years. Mm-hmm. And they built things, which is, of course, what the word civilization means. It means city building. That's all it really means. But they built stuff out of stone. Mm-hmm. We have things like Stonehenge. We have, where people collaborated, and it shows that they had enough food to have 10,000 people in the same place, which means it's an agricultural society. Mm-hmm. But what is coming back from this is that these were not warrior societies. These were societies that got together, had a big party, having built some stuff and carved some stuff on it, and then went their way. So one of the dangerous ideas that grew through the 20th century was Konrad Lorenz's idea of aggression. And it's still being taught. Lorenz was a Nazi, okay, during one period of his life. And he believed that human beings are violent and aggressive creatures. When Frans de Waal published Peacemaking Among Primates, another book which absolutely blew my mind when I read it, he said there have been this many thousand studies of aggression in human beings. So far, there have been 2 studies of reconciliation. That was in 1991.
Yeah, you brought that up before in earlier episodes we've done, and we're exploring that territory now because this is the key question of the episode here is are we naturally violent, aggressive, coercive, awful, abusive to each other? It seems by statistics and observation we are, and yet you can easily make the case, because we're so goddamn complicated, that you also find whole swaths of people who are pacifists, who don't want to have anything to do with any of that, who truly are willing to even separate from society, to have their own groups or cult. I mean, hell, this is where cults come from. Let's break off from society. Let's do our own little thing. And we'll manage it just fine without all these stupid rules and regulations and without all these idiots telling us what to do. We're going to do some stuff. Perfectly fine context, perfectly fine, reasonable, rational way to behave. But it just again seems to be the exception rather than the rule, And so how do we turn the rule into what is now the exception?
I believe, and it's why the 60% is so important. I believe that Eva Jablonka is right, that evolutionary development is happening now. It's not something that happened on the savannah. We don't have to, because we have language, and so therefore can determine culture, can change things. Look at the oppression. It really, you only come, it's about the end of the Second World War where people start in the West trying to be friendly to each other. Things like, the Studs Terkel, the great broadcaster, was standing at a bus stop one day and he said, I heard these two yuppies talking to each other. And one of them was saying, isn't socialism a terrible thing? And so I looked at them and said, how many hours do you work in a week? And they said 40. They said, well, without socialism, you'd still be working 70 hours a week. And the understanding of history that it was only by a mass labor movement that happened. But it's also fair to say that I think they're called the Council of Sinophobes, haters of Chinese people, was also formed within the American Labor Party in the 1880s, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which forbade Chinese people from entering the US. That leads into a whole discussion as to why drugs were prohibited, which is a discussion I'm quite happy to have for 3 or 4 hours some of the time.
Yeah, some other time, yeah.
But turning back, having identified, for me, political systems through the past have just not identified the problem. The problem is authoritarianism. The problem is, you talk about the natural behaviors among children. Well, yeah, we can grow up. And I think the fundamental problem in our society is we're not meant to grow up. We're meant to be consumers. On the one hand, we're meant to be recycling all this plastic garbage. And on the other hand, we're not meant to feel guilty that we're ruining the planet by recycling all this plastic garbage. That growing up, I used to believe that enlightenment, into my 50s, from the age of 17, I believed enlightenment was the goal, but one would become wise. One would get emotional equanimity, nothing would faze me. And in the end, I just went, no, what matters is my relationship with the world, with people, with my own family, most of all,
yep,
with my friends who are my adopted family. That's what really matters, so that when I'm having a dreadful time, they will sympathize with me and look after me, feed me chicken soup, whatever. And when they're having a dreadful time, I'll look after them. And again, I'm really with Eric Fromm on this, that as you mature, as you become an actual adult, your responsibility spreads further. It's not just about how am I going to eat? How are my kids going to eat? How is my tribe going to eat? How is my nation going to eat? It's about how is humanity going to eat? And for me, this came sideways because it's something I realized before I left Scientology in my 20s, that the only way forward for humanity was compassion. And I didn't see any of that in Scientology. Mm-hmm. That my benefit could only be served by everything around, life affirming, everything around benefiting. So if I did nasty, sneaky, horrible, vengeful things, it would come back to me, not because of karma, just because I'd be creating chaos wherever I went. Whereas, I had the head of intelligence in Scientology in 1993. She turned and started talking to me. And she said that she'd got 4 agents active, 1 in training, who were in my life. And that she got this problem, which was that every now and then, she'd been running harassment for 18 months on me. Somebody would come back to say, I can't do this to him anymore. He's such a nice guy. And that's all there is. That by growing up, by becoming intelligent, by becoming rational, we realize that what we do has an effect. How we feel, how we express ourselves towards others has an effect. And your situation and my situation is we've both had plenty of people come to us and thank us for having let them see things a different way and release themselves from traps and from horrific traumatic experiences so that they could live more happily in the world and more at ease. So I believe that the first thing is to recognize authoritarianism. And the second is to say, what can we do about it? How can I, so you read John Stuart Mill on liberty. That's a very good thing to do about it.
I will always endorse that.
Yeah, absolute primary text.
Oh, if you haven't read On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, you do not ever talk about free speech or basically human rights. I mean, the On Liberty is perhaps one of the most important documents ever. I mean, I just think it's up there.
Yeah, and it's very short, 100 pages or so.
Yep.
And it's 160 years ago this man published this thing. He says in our society women are slaves. Yeah. And he is grateful to his own wife for having helped him. And says, she's helped him think through all of this. Right. So he's
very much an post-enlightenment thinker. Very much.
Yeah. And very important. But I think that we can, by recognizing the characteristics of predators, and I've written that list and I've talked about it repeatedly over the last few years. We've just put up our 3rd version of the Human Predators video because we want to get it as good as we can. And I've just spread it in Russia, or just about to spread it in Russia, which is great. Recognizing that there are people who are mean and charming, who apologize and don't mean it, who break their promises, who lie, all rather obvious things, and registering that and going, I don't want that person to become president. I don't want that person to become mayor. I don't want them to become sheriff. I don't want them to teach my children. I've had 2 encounters with decidedly predatory teachers, both of whom, actually 2 of my children, have carried the effects of what was done to them, one at the age of 8, the other at the age of 9, by these teachers right through their lives. There's nothing I can do to undo what was done because I wasn't paying close enough attention. When I was paying close enough attention, I got the one sacked and frightened the living daylights out of the other. But, there are predatory people out there. And the thing is not to round them up and burn them at the stake.
Well, that's obviously where the next question is going, because you're right. And I can easily subscribe to that trifold model of, the bad guys, the predators, the enablers, and the people who go along with it, or can be made to go along with it. And it seems that we are sandwiched, these adults you speak of, these people who come to a growth development of realizing that they are part of the world. There is a responsibility they have. They have a responsibility to themselves, to the people around them, that they want to make things better, not worse. These kinds of things. Seems like that's not the majority of the population.
No, but I think there's a shifting number. And I think part of that shift is simply economic, that we're now at the point in the US where I believe 25% of people are below the poverty line. In this country, 20% of people. The numbers are way too high. But that used to be 70%. That used to be people would, desperately trying to make a living in the 1850s, if you look at that time particularly, that So before the Industrial Revolution, there were probably less poor people. Then the Industrial Revolution happens, and you get the ravages of capitalism. You get, people who just really don't care. I'm reading a wonderful novel called The Living by Annie Dillard, where she's talking about conditions in the Northwest, in Washington State, from the 1850s through the 1870s. And she talks about a guy who runs a shoe factory buying a racehorse for $160,000. At the same time, he is paying his workers $1 a day.
Right.
And that disparity, that idea of, in our time, the super rich, for me, anybody who's worth more than $100 million is a criminal.
I know there are a lot of different opinions about that. My wife and I, talk about this often, and I have had personally many changes of attitude about that. It's I guess it depends a little bit for me on the context, but I get the idea.
Oh, when Bill Gates boasted about how much money he'd made by funding vaccination, that he'd spent 10 million and made 27. Again, you're a criminal. You are a predatory human being who has used the misery of others to create profit and power. Nobody should have that much power. Nobody should have that much power. You can't call this a democracy where lobbyists, when John Kerry was standing for president, he had a marquee and you had to pay $150,000 to go into the marquee. That's not democracy. That's plutocracy.
I agree with you about that. I do agree with you about that.
So that whole nature. But I think if by understanding what authoritarians, what predators are, teaching people to be more responsible and to be more confident, all sorts of simple things. I mean, Ira Chalif's intelligent disobedience is wonderful. His courageous followership is wonderful. Assertiveness training for kids, so that kids, or the Matthew Lipman Socrates for 6-year-olds, which I've often talked about, where you get kids so they can talk about things, so that their opinion matters. And I think that you can move that 60%. I think the 60% is probably down to about 55% now. If we can just get it the other side, so it's 60% of people do think and care. My niece-in-law did a master's degree about 15 years ago, and she's in the executive that runs the local council and makes sure that everything gets done. She's really smart. And she was curious about democracy. And I gave her the rather lame title for her thesis, which was How Much Democracy is Enough? Because what she found was she sent out surveys and only about 30% of people filled them in. And when you see that people won't vote, and one can understand their apathy about that, given that the system doesn't seem to change. A friend of mine who says he doesn't believe in conspiracy theories wrote to me today saying, but of course we all know the world is actually run by these little cliques. And it's like, well, yes, New Scientist actually about 5 years ago repeated an financial investigation going all through the world, and came to the conclusion there are something like 150 groups that have power in the world, real power. Most of them corporations. Obviously, the Chinese government has a certain clout as well. Most of them banks and corporations, but they're all rivals with one another.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why I push back on that bullshit, because I know for a fact, as you just simply laid out, of course there are conspiracies. Of course people get together and work in collusion to enact legislation or make things happen that benefit them and maybe hurt a bunch of other people, and they don't really give a shit. Yeah. Yes, that happens every day of the week. But where I have to get on my soapbox is, this idea that 12 guys have been running things for centuries through these secret societies and the Illuminati, and it's all a Jewish conspiracy. I mean, this stuff is just for the birds. It's the stupidest possible interpretation of reality, because reality is multifaceted, is complicated, and as you just said, the De Beers are fighting, the Rockefellers are fighting, the Rothschilds are fighting, the Russian oligarchs are fighting, the West Coast elites are fighting the East Coast elites. These people are not all getting together at G6 summits and, here's how we're going to take over the world this year. This isn't how this works, not even remotely. So this is where I have to get on my
the
soapbox.
reality is, you put two rabbis in a room, you've got three opinions.
Exactly.
It's like when Hubbard talked about the psychiatric conspiracy. It's like, has he ever actually met any of these people?
Exactly.
Argue with each other.
It's the most ridiculous, simple Simon nonsense I've ever heard, But as you say, as you very, cogently point out, yeah, there are about 100, 150 groups that are that's where the consolidation of power has gone. And these people are not shy about using that power and throwing it around. And unfortunately, one of the other aspects of this whole big picture that we're talking about right now is the fact that those groups, if we're going to put them along the top of my imaginary hierarchy of power here, those groups utilize propaganda techniques that have been perfected over the last 100 years. And now digital social media is contributing to this, a la Social Dilemma and other things. You can break the code of that, but you can't see through it in a normal day-to-day activity. You do not have an awareness of how you are being manipulated by advertisement, media, news, etc. It's just the nature of it. It's deceptive by nature. But that's kind of a control thing itself. So again, I'm now, here we are, right? Like, okay, well, what do we do with this? Because I'm kind of getting on board with what you're talking about with authoritarianism. Like, okay,
well,
all right,
let's take the next level is we identify a human predator. Let's, for example, look at the banking crash of 2008.
Sure.
Now, that was precipitated by a small number of hedge fund managers, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs. Somebody was trying to sell the idea of Donald Trump to me and saying that Barack Obama was actually talking with somebody from Goldman Sachs. And I was like, yeah, but Trump's got 5 of them on his team.
Right.
What are you talking about?
Exactly.
But the guy from Lehman Brothers, and there's a wonderful documentary, I don't remember the name, sadly, where you see him on video it's an in-house video where he's talking about how he likes to reach in and rip somebody's heart out while he's selling them something. He walked. He is running another hedge fund now. So if you want to change the society quickly, when you get a mega criminal who has destroyed a system, you put them in prison.
Right.
You try them. So the big players in this idea that some guy who's shoplifted candy bars 3 times can spend a life in prison.
Exactly.
You've got to get rid of corrupt, stupid laws like that.
I'm telling you, this whole concept of white-collar crime being a lower tier of criminality, when in fact, white-collar crime is the crime that affects tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people at a shot. Your Bernie Madoffs of the world. These guys spend time in Club Fed, get out, get a podcast, get a book, get a speaking deal. Like, this is how our society is structured badly, destructively so.
Yeah.
Now, I've thought about this in terms of, okay, well, there's a lot of factors here. There's a lot of things going on that make it that way. I think maybe you're onto something with the human predators thing in terms of, real seminal, like foundational reasons these systems exist and then perpetuate themselves. But again, we're talking about systemic changes necessary at like really high levels in order to even begin to turn this train or boat in a different direction than the one it's going full speed ahead on right now.
Those changes have happened in some cultures. That looking at, say, Germany after World War II, when Adenauer adopted the constitution, Germany is a more fair society than almost any society that's ever existed. I mean, I still don't particularly want to live there, but I don't speak German, so it would be difficult for me. Mm. Having said that, my girlfriend does speak German, so it might be possible. But their laws are more sensible. What we have to do is to create, human capital is based upon two ideas: justice and education. Those are the two things you have to have. Now, our education system is not teaching people the right things. And it's still stuck in some kind of 19th century model of geography, history, physics, and this. I found my son's just finished what would be senior high school in the US. So he has 4 advanced levels. 3 of his topics, biology, psychology, and sociology, were at least 20 years out of date in their information. Right. The biology course didn't even have epigenetics in it.
Right.
So we've got this, and every time I complained to teachers, and I did it many times, I was told the same words were used. You've got to jump through the hoops. And the hope is that by the time you get to a doctorate, you'll be able to get an education. And I'm saying, no hoop jumping. When my son is taught about Macbeth, if he's going to have to read this dire suicidal play, which has some of the most beautiful language in the world, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps on this petty, all our yesterdays. Classic stuff. But how depressing for a 15-year-old. If he's going to have to read this stuff, he should know why it was written. In 1606, November the 5th, the year before, there was an attempt to blow up Parliament. The explosion would have taken out possibly 2 square miles. That's how much gunpowder they'd managed to stack there.
You're talking about the Guy Fawkes plot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason plot. This had happened just a few months before he wrote this play. The play is about Scottish king being murdered. The only 2 murders that happen off stage in Shakespeare are in that play. Oh, the prediction by the witches, James I, who was the king, had just imprisoned the children's players because he thought they were taking the piss out of him. So Shakespeare's the king's player, so he's a little bit worried. This is the king that wrote the book Demonology about witchcraft. He's really into them. Hubble, bubble, toil and trouble. And Banquo, Macbeth is told you'll be king, and Banquo is told your descendants will be king. James I believed himself, James VI of Scotland as he was, believed himself to be the descendant of Banquo. I get into this stuff, and now I'm fascinated by this play that bores the hell out of me because of, how clever Shakespeare is in managing to get a guy who hates plays to come and watch one of his plays and not put him in prison afterwards.
Right.
If you put any of that in the answers to the exam, you get 0 marks.
Right.
Because it's the robot marker. It's like,
exactly.
You are meant to quote this. I would like to see education happening in education. I'd like to see the work of Sir Ken Robinson, broadly, they're bestsellers anyway, but broadly read. Schools that are about, these schools that you hear of, and there are some, where kids go early in the morning. They go at the weekends, they stay in the evening because they're so fascinated by what they're doing. School's not meant to be boring.
Exactly.
Education is the most fascinating thing that can happen outside of, we won't get into that. But we need education fixing. We need to go back and make it exciting and interesting. And we need to deal with the corruption in our system by having a judicial system that is fast, effective, and not punitive, not something that hurts people and puts them in a school for criminals for a few years so they learn all the tricks and hate everybody and come out, but that actually does reform and rehabilitate people and keeps the really dangerous ones away from the rest of us. They're simple ideas, but we're just seeing people fiddling at the edges rather than going, let's take those bankers that walked away with their bonuses of tens of millions of dollars. Let's first of all have the money back. Mm-hmm. And let's secondly try them. And,
exactly.
And not allow a legal system like in the US where if you want to do anything, it takes 20 to 25 years.
Or conversely, a legal system where if you're the one walking in with the $25 million lawyer, you're walking out of that courtroom scot-free because justice can be bought. And that is not universally true. And Keith Raniere, for example, just got 120 years and he had no shortage of money. So it's not a universal principle that if you got money, it's a get out of jail free card, but it sure as hell helps. It
But if
sure as
you've
hell
committed
helps.
an outrage to the extent that Raniere had,
Yeah.
there's no way you can get away with it.
Exactly.
But
and as outraged as people were about the housing crisis, they also didn't understand what the hell happened for a couple years. And that's how these guys eluded justice, is they got away with it because in the crisis of the moment, they were invisible to most people. It took years for Adam McKay and other people to put The Big Short and other movies and documentaries together and go, what the hell just happened to us? Because it was a 20-year, 30-year previous earlier beginning to that. The housing crisis didn't all happen in 2007 or 8. It had been building for decades based on people who, what's that?
Or not building.
Yeah, exactly. Though this bubble was growing, right? And these bubbles grow.
Nobody was making the buildings.
Exactly. But we could also, of course, get into the whole financial shenanigans that go on this planet too. But that's way beyond the point.
It's important to know, because it's not broadly known, that the boom to bust has happened just about every 20 years, going back into the 18th century.
Yep.
And the same thing happens every time. The Mississippi bubble, the South Sea bubble, the Panama Canal bubble, the Suez Canal bubble. One time after another, the whole currency of France was lost. And the revolution, the probable cause of it, is that Louis XIV invested in the Louisiana scandal, that there was nothing there. And the French currency came to be based upon the bonds for this Louisiana business, which didn't exist. And seeing that happen over and over again, and the people who suffer are the regular people.
That's right.
And the people who get away with it shouldn't get away with it. There shouldn't be a statute of limitations. But it is a matter of naming and shaming, most certainly. I mean, one of the participants in the WorldCom Enron scandal, there was a guillotine in time, and this person had taken their money out 2 weeks before that guillotine and became the second largest landowner in Colorado. And you go, no guillotine, give us the money back. Let's sort this out. But and part of that is also what's called the Stetson effect, which is a member of the Stetson hat family said about racism that, if you feel too frightened to complain when somebody says something racist, at least don't smile. At least don't be approving, And I think there are, simple and fundamental changes in our behavior that really could happen, and it could happen overnight. If every child in the world saw Blink, Think, Choice, Voice, the 3.5-minute video that Ira Chaleff has made, and it affected 1% of them, the world would change.
That's the kind of fundamental thing I'm talking about, and I'm glad we came to this point then, because this is the kind of thing that is fundamental to the human experience around the world. I mean, education, for example, you're talking about, and you're talking about something on the order of the kind of reform we talk about when we're talking about reforming the police, like a bottom-up redo. I could just bottom up. I mean, and I went on a whole roll about that on this very show, right? About, or on my channel, you could do, it's not a matter of we're going to make everybody better by injecting a critical thinking class in second grade or in fifth grade or in sixth grade or at college level or something. That is so not the estimation of effort necessary to meet the problem that we were talking about, right? And I'm bringing up very, like core stuff about human beings when I'm talking about, when you and I are talking about narcissism and authoritarianism and instincts or drives amongst human predators in that direction, and the fact that there is a rather too high percent of our population, any given population, who have these predator types, and we kowtow to them. We have given over authority to them. So I think I'm starting to kind of get in focus. This is is this what you're talking about with authoritarianism, is that we are giving over to these predators the power and authority that they grab. They are the ones who make a beeline for it. Your sheeple, as I hate that word, but I'll just throw it out there for that class of people who just kind of go along with anything. They exist. And they'll go along with these people. So it really does fall to, and this isn't some, revolutionary talk or matrix speak or something. A small group of people are fight. There's a good chunk of people in this world, millions and millions and millions of us, who like Jon and I, like, we educate ourselves. We respond to morals and ethics and reason. And we have this idea that the world can be a better place. And if we can somehow make a few adjustments, maybe we could stop having these predator types just so easily get into positions of power and authority where they can manipulate harmfully other people. I guess the answer really then is more of a sociological answer or a societal answer than it is a psychological answer, because we don't yet have a grip on how to change a sociopath. I mean, you've cited a couple of examples of some teaching and some work that can be done early on, but I don't know that you can take a 25, 30-year-old narcissist and make them not that way anymore. I don't know that that's possible as we understand these terms right now.
I think you can, if more people recognize them. I mean, Snakes in Suits. It is I think, not a particularly well-written book, sadly, but at the core of it is some of the highest level investigation of psychopathic behavior. And what's being shown there is how, somebody in the human resources department in a corporation can recognize that they're dealing with a bullshit artist. Right. They're dealing with somebody who's dangerous. And the problems are fundamentally ethical, that, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. That it's fundamentally saying the degree of corruption that exists is not acceptable. And, when Tony Blair, who I believe was the causal agent of the Iraq War, I don't believe it was George W. Bush. I think it was Blair, Rumsfeld, and of course, Dick Cheney.
Yes.
Tony Blair came back a couple of years ago. I believe he made $25 million lecturing at Yale University in the year after he had to resign as prime minister. Yeah. And wow. I was among the voices that said he should be tried as a war criminal, because he knew that it was not the truth, that the two witnesses that caused the Iraq war were both fabulists. They had the prime informant in Iraq was the foreign minister, and they didn't listen to him. They listened to two random characters because they wanted a war.
Right.
What Tony Blair said was, I believed that what I was doing was the right thing. Just like to point out, Tony Blair's a lawyer. If you go into court and you say to the judge, I believed that murdering the old lady was the right thing to do, then it won't wash. And it shouldn't wash. No. And so I have various other
But you have to admit that in the PR world, it's a strategy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And we need to understand propaganda better. So, yep. I have three little things now. One is the human predator and how to recognize them. The second is the seduction and recruitment techniques that are used by such predators.
Yes.
And the third is propaganda or fake news and alternative facts. That it horrifies me that I can explain these three things to anybody in about 10 minutes each. They're not complicated ideas. It's really easy to see these people. The person who comes up to you and says, oh, wow, you're fantastic. I love you. You're brilliant. You're my best friend. It's like, what are you trying to sell me? Mm-hmm. It's that simple. Anybody that's flattering me, anybody that's schmoozing me. It's that simple. Fake news and propaganda. I went to the great Anthony Pratkardis, co-author of Age of Propaganda, co-author of Weapons of Fraud, editor of Influence magazine, one of the great psychologists of the age. And I went to him because I wanted to write it's about 3 or 4 years ago, I wanted to write something about simple description of fake news and propaganda. And I said, what about using the Institute for Propaganda Analysis as points from 1938, thinking you'll say, oh, you are so out of date. And, hoping that he'd tell me what I ought to look at. I am a bit sneaky sometimes. And he came back and I think he used the word superb. Mm-hmm. That in 1938, it's right there on Wikipedia. I've done a piece on my channel about it recently. Just this simple list of points that are so obvious, and we fall for them.
That's right.
Every time.
Well, I'll tell you the hardest part. I'll tell you from my own experience, the hardest thing to get across to people is not the data, not the raw data of how it's done. It's getting across to them that they, as an individual, are susceptible to it. Because everybody reads this stuff or learns this stuff as though it applies to everybody else, but they're the goddamn exception. Yep. Every single person.
There's a reason for that. It's taken me a long time to get it down to a simple point. I've been talking about the invisibility barrier for many years. This, advertising works on other people, but not on me.
Right.
And it finally struck me why that would have to be so. If I didn't believe my perception and interpretation of the world, I wouldn't be able to function.
You're right.
So I have to believe it. And confirmation or my side bias, therefore, has to be there. And a friend was telling me the other day, and that why was it that if you gave people evidence that what they believed was wrong, they believed it more strongly? And I said, cognitive dissonance. And he said, sorry, what's that? It's like, okay.
Yep.
Just getting that idea over. And for me, the transition came when I started to enjoy cognitive dissonance. When somebody challenged something, hopefully politely, that I was saying, and I've seen you do the same thing. You've done it in this conversation where you go, oh yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of it that way. Right. We enjoy it.
That's right.
We like having our minds changed. We don't feel frightened that it'll turn us into zombies or anything. To actually be sensible about things, to believe evidence, and to change our minds along the way.
One almost wonders, as a cult survivor, as you are a cult survivor, as we are, in other words, trauma survivors, people who have had the stark, undeniable, irrefutable evidence that we were idiots, that we acted like fucking morons for an extended period of time.
I still do.
Well, and you come, but that's actually the point, is you come to learn there's a wisdom of, there's a humility to be gained by an experience like that. And I wonder as I sit here right now, if part of this educational process, I don't know that you could do this in an ethical manner. I just don't know how to even begin to do this. But how, put everybody through, some kind of process where they're all in. Actually, the framework for this actually already exists if we would use it as a teaching moment. And the framework that exists to teach children this are the childhood myths: Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, Tooth Fairy. They're already built into our society. The thing that we fail to make it an educational moment when the light bulb clicks on and they go, wait a second, this isn't true.
You're lying to me.
You're lying to me, right? And then if we as parents or we as authority figures or teachers or whatever, educators, then said, yep, I did lie to you. And here's why I lied to you. One,
I
two,
hate
three.
you.
Well, it's not I hate you. However, let's acknowledge that Santa Claus is a wonderful control mechanism to keep kids in line around Christmas time and maybe all year if you really stretch it. So, yes, I did. I lied to you. I didn't. I purposefully told you something that was not true in order to control and manipulate your behavior. And if you could communicate that to an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old in a way that they get, that's a life lesson they'll probably never forget. But as it is, we instead walk away with my parents are liars, society sucks, it's all, why does anybody talk about Santa Claus? Santa Claus is a myth, etc. But it persists because it's such a great control mechanism for these kids. And so we keep using it.
I've got the best of them all. And I had to buy it. It was in the local pharmacy a couple of years ago. They were selling this thing before Christmas called an elf detector. And you put it on the ceiling in the kids' room and tell them it's watching them all the time.
Oh, man. Oh, no. Hubbard talked about that kind of control mechanism in a lecture. He said you could flat out, he said, okay, now this is obviously a tall tale, but I just have to relate this because it's so funny, he said there are societies in the past where they just set up a tower in the neighborhoods. There's a tower. There's the tower in the neighborhood with a great big dome on the top of it. And they told everybody in the society, that dome up there, that's reading the thoughts of everybody in this community. It's an automatic surveillance system.
Huawei tower.
That's right. And it's a thought control mechanism, right? Sounds far-fetched until you actually start telling people things that aren't true and you find out how susceptible to untruth people all can be.
And you move it over in Scientology to, when I finally, and I wasn't traumatized in Scientology, just like to point that out. I was sure as heck traumatized after it.
Right.
But when I got onto the operating Thetan superhuman type levels after 7 years, I find they're complete nonsense. And all of that time for 7 years, you've been thinking, oh, these people, they can read my mind.
That's right. That's exactly right. My godfather, who I, grew up around, was on staff with in Santa Barbara, flat out told me, he would just say stuff like, yeah, I had to turn my telepather off because I was getting riddled with too many people's thoughts and stuff. Like, this is the shit people told me when I was growing up. I believe this was an accurate reflection of reality. And I was terrified that the OT Scientologists on staff, when I first got there, were reading my damn mind. I was convinced that they could.
Made you have all sorts of perverse, filthy thoughts.
Of course it did.
And that led us to where we are today.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, I think actually this is really good because this conversation has actually brought me to a place where I'm thinking more in solutions than problems, and I like that way of thinking. That's my preferred way of thinking. And I think you've presented me with some responses to some of my queries or ideas or premises that has got me thinking. And like I said, I love that. But more importantly, I think that these are not exactly practical solutions, but they are necessary ones. And by practical, I mean it's not like you or I can individually go enact this. We need to drum up support. We need people to get on the bandwagon with this. And when we're talking about educational reform, we're not talking about changing some textbooks or changing a few commas or offering a critical thinking class. That is not what is needed to change this condition. We have as we've talked about here in this very wide-ranging conversation, we've got a lot of social factors, we've got a lot of historical factors, cultural factors, and then there's our genetics, and we're still figuring all that stuff out. So rather than say, okay, well, it's all fucked, and it's all horrible, and there's nothing we can do, maybe we should start putting our efforts and energies into these ideas, and it's been a struggle for me to try to figure out what direction should I be going in, because once you come to the realization that you're not going to save the world by yourself,
It'd take at least two people.
That's right. That's why I'm talking to you.
Two terminal universe.
That's exactly right. So I think that's why we do a podcast, is so we can get these ideas out there. And
something that's come to me recently, and I've had a number of conversations recently with one with a countercult activist who actually has done the course that you're doing, and he just seemed to have, he's doing what he can, but he just seemed to have come to such a cynical place. He didn't really believe it was going to make that much difference. And then a week later, I talked with a friend who's a psychiatrist, and who's been tremendously active and is a really positive person. And again, I got this sense of, you can't change anything and nothing can happen. And I really don't think that's true, because we don't send 4-year-old children up chimneys anymore.
True.
It's largely true because we've got gas heating, obviously, but that things have significantly changed. In 1914, in this country, the suffragette movement made a deal with the government that they would stop protesting and committing terrorist acts. Let's be honest about this: setting fire to things, breaking windows, what have you. They would, and I'm not, their cause was absolutely right, but their approach was a little terroristic. But they made a deal that instead they would hand out white feathers to any man who was not wearing an army uniform. And they were given the vote. After the war, the 30-year-old women were allowed to vote. What happened at the beginning of that war was that people queued to go and slaughter people in another country. Mm-hmm. What happened in the last invasion of the Gulf in this country was that 1 million people went out on the streets and said, "Not in my name." Now, I do know that there were similar demonstrations by America First in the 1930s, so it's not a new idea. But I think there is a change happening in our willingness to be prey.
Yeah.
So I don't take the Donald Trump view that you're either a predator or prey. I am all for becoming a non-predator, a helpful person, a compassionate person, and non-prey, and helping the people are preyed upon. So getting rid of the predator-prey aspect of humanity, as best we can.
Exactly. At least the interspecies predator-prey relationship that we do to each other. Yeah. If we could just get a little bit more unity and compassion and tolerance for ourselves as a species. Yeah. Well.
No, I don't eat KFC. That's not true. I'm with Buckethead on that one.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I do like chicken.
I like chicken. I just don't like KFC, and as I'm gluten intolerant, I can't eat it anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Well, who else doesn't like KFC? I just happened to read this morning, actually. Who else doesn't like KFC? Colonel Sanders.
Yeah, I can't blame him.
Yeah, he actually sold the whole thing, and then just was the brand spokesperson, but found himself hating it more and more and more as the years went on, because they were corrupting his process, corrupting the entire thing. It was just like McDonald's, the fast food. Let's make it.
Ronald McDonald, an interview now. He's really, he never eats the stuff anymore.
Yeah, pretty bad.
I think one of the things to bring hope is to say there actually are already hundreds of thousands of people around the world doing positive things that are making a change.
Yep.
And I'd like to recommend this book. He modestly calls himself Ken Robinson on
yeah, could you read the title and author for the podcast folks who can't see it?
Yeah. He is Sir Ken Robinson. He's been knighted in this country for his services. He's been made a baronet, as we say. And the book is called Creative Schools. He wrote another book called The Elements. In this book, he shows you that hundreds of schools have transformed, and that there are kids who are getting a proper education all over the world. And so it's a process. We're not at the beginning of something here. We're just helping to move it along. And I'd also like to recommend a documentary that is called The Serengeti Rules. And it's a beautifully made documentary. The film quality is fantastic. But in the introduction, the guy who wrote the book, The Serengeti Rules, explains that, yes, all of the nature documentaries we see now are doom and gloom. And, it's really terrible. This is a documentary about how they found out about what are called keystone species, which are some of them predators and some of them not, which by reintroducing them, rewilding, they've been able to actually change whole environments. It's been happening for several decades now, and it's almost unreported. So I think we need a boost to understand that the world is not all going to hell, that there are a lot of people doing great work. Because I think that the malaise of, well, what's the point? I might as well go down and buy myself some new clothes from China to keep the slave industry going there. I might as well, what does it matter? It does matter. Each one of us and what we do and what we believe, I think it's one of the things I love about the evolutionary development model, which Yuval describes in some detail on my channel, is that it's not a kind of you're now a cog in a machine. Everybody's important. Everybody is important, and how every one of us behaves towards other people, it matters because the knock-on effects are unknown. So it's my nature perhaps, but I seek to be friendly with people.
Yes,
I think
I do. Same, man. I get it.
Yeah, it
Conflict
makes me feel
is just
better. It makes me feel better.
Yeah.
And I seek to resolve arguments, and I seek to have discussions rather than arguments. And I don't want to boss anybody around or make them feel small, which is, of course, what predators do. I want people, when I leave the room, I want people to feel, a bit more cheerful than they did than when I went in. Unless I'm feeling depressed, and then obviously I'll just, no. But I generally, there's an attitude towards life, and that attitude does pay back. I was harassed for 16 years by Scientology after I left, and it was severe. When Paulette Cooper, when we were at Toronto, said, "You never get over it," that's true. Mm-hmm. There are things, when I see a manila envelope, I'm still afraid it's going to be a legal writ. Mm-hmm. When I see the light flashing on my answer phone, there's still something in the back of my mind that says it's going to be one of my lawyers calling, even though that was 20 years ago. Right. But it does get less and less with time. And the positive effect for me, when I came back and started talking again in 2013, having been away since 1996, it was amazing because for the 12 years that I did, nobody said thank you to me. When I was going bankrupt, the 500 people I'd helped through their recovery, not one of them came to help me. So I developed a certain misanthropic view about humanity. When I came back, there was this flood of appreciation that people saying, I read Piece of Blue Sky, it changed my life. It did something. And that is, I give the same example every time. The woman wrote to me and she said, 15 years ago, you spent an afternoon with me. You probably don't remember me. And I didn't. I didn't recognize the name on the letter. That afternoon changed my life. Until then, everything was a mess because of Scientology. Since then, I am in a happy marriage. I have children who are healthy. I have a career. And I put it all down to that one afternoon. Now, she made the change. I was just a catalyst for that change. But to know that that has happened, to know that you've had a positive effect for 15 years on somebody's life, everything becomes worthwhile. Yeah. And, psychologically, it's something, that's a tremendous boost. And I would recommend it. Pleasure and thrills and all of that. We need that too. We do, even if it's KFC, which I think is a bit of a naughty pleasure. But happiness is something that comes out of the sense that you've contributed something.
That's right.
And that something good has happened as a consequence of what you've done. It doesn't come from getting your revenge on people.
No, it
I've
doesn't.
never met anybody who'd become happy by being horrible to other people. No.
That's right.
Oh, that person may be out there, and if they'd like to write something in the comments section,
yeah, exactly. We'll probably hear from them. Well, I couldn't agree more. So on that note, I think we're at a good place to wrap up here for this week. This has been, like I said, a very far-ranging conversation, fascinating one, and didn't end up where I thought it might go. But that's pretty par for the course for us, but in a good way. It always seems to be in a pretty good way.
Yeah, every conversation we've had has had moments of disagreement and dispute, which I think is very healthy. There are times when each of us has been wrong. So it's mostly you, obviously.
Of course, obviously.
No, there are times when each of us has been wrong and when each of us has put the other right. But at the end of every conversation that we've had, and this is 16 or 17 now, it's somewhere along there, we've come to a point of resolution where we both feel cheerful about having talked with each other. What could be better than that? You know?
Exactly. And I hope, folks, that you guys out there are following along the same way. I really do. I hope that this has given you some degree of hope, because it did me. And I hope that this has given you some degree of like, oh, here's something I could put some effort into. Here's something I could contribute some money to. Here's something I could think about more and maybe communicate to other people, friends, family. You know, it's not just about sending money, or it's not just about, thumbs up and likes. It's about taking these ideas, making them your own, contributing to them, spreading them, getting them out there. That's influence. That's how we change the world, I guess you could say. And I am not one for preaching about mantras of saving the world or changing the world. But in this case, this is a topic that we've got to deal with. And now that we're starting to understand it, coercive control, authoritarianism, high control groups, extremism, radicalization, there's so many words we could throw at this. But they all come down to these concepts of people being awful to other people on purpose, and doing it for extended periods of time. We don't have to put up with it. We can recognize it now, and we can start making some changes in that direction. And all of us have to get on board with that to do it. So that's my soapbox pitch at the end of this thing. And thank you very much for watching, everybody. Jon?
Let me just add one thing. When I was a teenager, I learned the word amelioration, which I thought was a lovely word, and which means to make something better. So the idea of making the world perfect has never really struck me.
Yeah.
But if it's just if I can spread a little happiness as I walk by, if we can, it's ameliorating things, it's making them better. And I'm going to put in a plug here that anybody that has not gone to the Lyrical Wax, that's WHACKS YouTube channel, is a very naughty person. You should go there straight away and subscribe, because my partner and I have put together this new channel, and Lyrical Wax, and we have a task. It's one of those kind of Lord of the Rings adventures, that you can be involved with. And the task is this: Faber and Faber, who are the most famous poetry publishers in the world, have 86 subscribers on their podcast. We so far today have 34, and we're determined to beat them. So please come and have a look and subscribe.
Link below, guys. Check out the description section of show notes at sensiblyspeaking.com. I will post that channel there for you.
Great. And they're blatant advertising on my part.
Yes, absolutely. Propaganda. How dare you? How dare you engage in that manipulative advertising?
Giving stuff away for free, as usual.
Yes, exactly. The first 30 listeners will get $1 million each. Whoa. Okay.
He promised it. You heard him.
All right, folks.
Okay. Great pleasure. I'm Jon Atack. This is Chris Shelton, And thankfully, I'm still Jon Atack and he's still Chris Shelton, even after all of that intermingling of ideas.
Exactly.
And it's been great, Chris. Thanks so much.
Thanks, John. All right, guys. Bye-bye.